All right, Steve Wood, recovered alcoholic. Well, welcome to a Way Out book study. Me flying solo night. Howard cannot be here. Um, so last week we got into how it works, and actually, it's our 2 weeks ago we started how it works. And the first week, Howard did a really good presentation on how it all came together and to that point, and how it was written and stuff. Very good stuff. And then last week we finally got into the pages of it, and we did the first two pages, and we talked about how honesty is awareness of where I'm at, of how do I have resentments, do I have, this the rigorous honesty, and then about being completely honest, and we just got deep on everything on that page. So let's just bring us up the pace where we are. It's the end of 1937. Um, will become, AA was on fire, give or take 40 members or so. And, Bill's realizing we're onto something big. And there was ideas, passed around to bring their message. And, there's only, two states that had meetings at the time were Akron and New York. There was guys from other states, but that's where their meetings were. But his idea, that or at least the one that was tossed around was perhaps maybe going to speaking tour, but that was unrealistic. And so they came up with an idea for a book. It was originally called its code name was Book of Experience, and eventually, the title would become is just The Big Book, not The Big Book, but Alcoholics Anonymous. The thing about Bill and the people that helped him and stuff, and they were all, including Bill. He was very, very, they looked at what they were, Bill looked at what he was doing was groundbreaking. And he looked at it as that this could change the world. And, and in his mind, there was no failure in this. And people had a great attitude. Bill can really pull this off. And, people want to say there was these committees and this and that. I'll get into that. And that's all hearsay now. It's like, that's turned out to be not true. And I mean, like Bill S. stated that Bill pretty much wrote the big book in a vacuum, meaning by himself, and there wasn't as much help as they made it sound. I think they want to make it look like everyone helped him, but that's not to say true. But the people that did help him, there was Fitz Mayo, but Bill had 3.5 years, and Fitz barely had 2 years. Hank Parker said 2 years. Another guy that helped was, Jimmy Burwell, but he had probably only had a few months. Um, they all contributed here and there. Um, I think the ones that contributed the most were Ruth Hawks, secretary, and we'll see how it goes from the big book. I mean, the original manuscript to the big book. But I think Ruth's, she's being the typist, all the grammar changes and stuff like that were on her. But if you ask me who helped them probably the most, influence wise, is probably Sam Shoemaker from Oxford, from the Oxford group. I'll get more into that too. But the thing about it is, Bill was a visionary, big ideas, sometimes crazy ideas. And you think of a visionary, you think, of imagination, envisioning the future, thinking ahead. And Bill, is a perfect mold for that. Um, but he knew every part of this book needed to connect to the real alcoholic. Um, and when they started, to lay out the big book, he got, that's when he, started asking for help, and he couldn't find it. And that's, you know, Bill wanted every voice to be a part of it, but it didn't really go that way. And but the rumors were he had committees. He had conservatives, which were the evangelistic Christian types. I think that was more just Fitz he was describing, and Fitz was a hardcore Oxford Group member, a Episcopal minister's son, and he wanted the book. I think he suggested maybe some Christian doctrine in there. So I've read rumored he wanted even Bible references, but that didn't happen. And then the other group that was rumored was the liberals, but that's just hearsay now. And it's like, but these were the more less aggressive religious members, maybe more spiritual. I don't even know if there was any of those guys were like that necessarily. And then there was the radical group, and this is the one. So that these are the guys that probably had the most influence on him, but it was really just one guy, and they're agnostic, agnostic ones, and the guy really that was Hank Parkhurst, and Hank was a former agnostic who believed in universal power, and he wanted to downplay as much, you know, religious talk, and he wanted maybe he wanted more of a little bit of psychological stuff in there to lure the alcoholic in, but he was the right man when Bill was writing the book. He was smart, outspoken. I like Bill, a salesman, very straightforward, extremely. And Bill, if it was not for Hank Parkhurst, this book would not have been written, you know. Um, I mean, Bill, swung the pen, so to speak, but no Hank, no big. Plus, he got to help get it published and everything. He did all that stuff. He really pushed Bill, and there was also, of course, Burwell, who was an atheist, but he's known as this very kind of aggressive, argumentative type of guy, but he's extremely intelligent. Um, Maybe these guys wanted the words like spiritual nature or power grading yourself, and who knows. But the chapters, there's a solution and more about alcoholism. They got roughed out, by Bill, fairly easy. I mean, compared to the other chapters, they went smooth, and we agnostics brought, I think a little bit of when he presented to these other guys, a little bit of confusion at first, but I think they all agreed upon it. But you know, such as how many times God was written and stuff like that. But this is what Bill said one time when he got to the section of the book. He says, "I felt more like an umpire than an author." And at times it felt like a painful process where there could be fierce arguments. The hassling over the chapters were, in my mind, horrific. I don't know if he meant in his own mind, but I was exhausted on many. I felt like throwing the book out the window. That's how frustrated he was. And I think because he was doing it by himself. Um, and but arriving at chapter 5, he says, this is Bill, I was dreading the reaction of the other alcohol of what other alcoholics might think. A heavy burden weighed over me because it was time to lay out the program. Um, was really about was we're talking really about how the program really worked, and I knew the writing what I was going to write would be the backbone of this movement. If it was written wrong, the movement would fall on its face. So, look at it this way. That last part where he said, if it was written wrong, this could fall on its face. Think about that for a second. And Bill's already an alcoholic. He has that type of thinking, and he's thinking that way. So basically, this is where he's going to write precisely how to show how we recovered, how it works, how the solution works. How the steps work. But now he's getting into the steps he's been thinking about for a long time. Writing that, it was extremely important and it had to be alive. Um, this was, remember just a word of mouth program with around, like I said, not many members and maybe 40. And they did a variation of probably less than that at the time because when the big book came out, there was like 40 members, 50 members, but did a variation of, you know, with those, there's rumors about 6 steps that's been debunked. I think we'll see in here, I'll point that out, but they did a variation of Oxford principles, and I think it is kind of varied amongst everywhere else. But his goals were to break down those 6 principles that they were, using and break them into smaller pieces. So he had a ton of pressure on him. But, you know, and the more pressure because he was doing a lot by himself. But people trusted him. They knew he had vision. I don't think anybody really wanted to like combat him because maybe they thought it hurt his feelings or something like that. Who knows? But he wasn't sure if he could do it. And, you know, as much as they may have helped him, or anyone would help, I don't think there's much there. Um, But he did ask Oxford Group founder Sam Shoemaker, who was a co-founder with Frank Bookman, to um, write the expanded steps. And Sam refused to do that. He said it needed to come from Bill. And that's what he kept hearing from everyone else. And that really, I believe Shoemaker had a big influence on him in here because he was very smart. And I think that's where a lot of this stuff came from. I think a lot of this came from just Bill picking his brain. But here's what Bill said about writing the 2 pages of how it works, talking from 58 to the ABCs. This is from I think Pass It On. I remember the evening which the 12 steps were written. I was lying on bed on my Clinton Street his apartment with a pencil in a hand and a pad of yellow scratch paper, feeling dejected and suffering from one of my imaginary ulcer attacks. I was in this anything but spiritual mood. I could not get my mind on the job, much less put my heart into it. But here was one of those things things that had to be done. It needed to be as clear and comprehensive as possible. If it was written poorly or too advanced, it would not work. And this is what Bill says too. I remember running over in my mind the word of mouth phrases that we had been using, jotting down that those they lined up to 6. And most likely, speaking of the 6, is the powerlessness, which he got from Shoemaker. I mean, not Shoemaker, but Silkworth. And then moral inventory, confession, amends, helping others, and you know, um, prayer and meditation. Now, of course, the confession and amends, helping others, and prayer and meditation came from Oxford Group. So they were doing that for sure. Moral inventory was not a thing in the Oxford Group. That was something that I know Shoemaker suggested to Oxford Group members before they did a confession to write out like their resentments. I don't think they inventoried them necessarily, but I think all that progressed. And yeah, I remember metaphysics move was happening and a lot of stuff was complex and you wanted to go deeper on things. But what Bill saw was those principles were not defined enough. And if they kept using them, eventually it would get more spread because the members were growing, and the more you have, everyone's are having their own steps. You can imagine. That's why they're making this book. But here's what Bill said again. I sat out to draft more than those 6 principles. How many I I did not know. Perhaps those 6 chunks of truth should be broken up into smaller pieces, enlarging the scope of considerably. All I knew was we needed a definite statement of concrete principles that were clear and comprehensive as possible. There could be not one single loophole to which the rationalizing drunks could wiggle out of. Feeling uninspired, I asked for guidance. So here's a very important thing he's saying. Uninspired, like he said earlier, frustrated, he's asking for guidance. So once he does that, check this out. Then the words began to tumble out with astonishing speed. My pencil began to fly off the paper. My thoughts continued to flow as I wrote. Rarely have a certain person failed to thoroughly follow their directions. I kept writing until I felt I should stop and review what I had written. Now, rumor is when he stopped, that was like 15 minutes. That's crazy. He stopped, after the steps. Numbering the new set of principles, I was rather surprised that they added up to 12. A symbolic number, I thought 12 steps. I'm sorry, symbolic number, I thought 12 apostles, a good significant figure in Christianity and mystic lore. I was convinced that our society should have 12 steps. So again, every part of the chapter needed to connect. and Bill was, you know, 3 years sober, but very guided, God flowing through his veins. But I think there was more going on him when he's writing at this moment, because when he asked for guidance and it flew out all of a sudden when he was ejected, I believe some maybe that we call divine intervention was going on. And divine intervention means that some type of spiritual nature comes, at hand, active involvement, you know. I mean, think about you ready, ask for guidance, and it flew out 6 and 12. Boom, look at the 12 steps they are today. If anything written wrong, we wouldn't even be having this meeting. We never even hear of AA. It's a miracle how flawless it turned out. We all know where miracles come from. And Bill felt the same thing here, I believe. You know, Perhaps another spiritual experience. And he couldn't, wait to talk to people about it. And this was part we used to believe, and they used to, mention in AA stories. He would bring them back to the people, and they would say, why 12 steps and why God and why that turned out that's just not true. That's just Bill trying to make it sound good in his books he did, but it was debunked. Um, he pretty much Everyone just said great, and that's again, he got very frustrated. He didn't get the feedback he wanted. They just knew So let's go to 59 and let's see how these steps are roughed out. Now, here's the thing: is there was rumors of a rough draft on the yellow sheet of paper, and there's no proof of that. So I try to stick to facts as much as possible. I'm stick to the manuscript. I might mention the rumored rough draft and what they did, you know, before the original manuscript step, um, but here's what it said in original manuscript. It says, so we know what the big book says. Here are the steps we took, which are suggested program of recovery. The original manuscript says, now we think you can take it. Here are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery. So you think about it, that's Bill again going, now you think you can take it. That's where people looked at it. There's a few writer friends that said, like the guy who changed it from you to we. So there was, when, like I mentioned, the draft, when you write it, you write a book, you can probably, scribble ideas on there, and then you turn it into a manuscript. Um, but what I'm going to do is, like I said, look at how they evolved. So step one, now the rumored word of mouth was we admitted we were licked for powers of alcohol, but who knows? That Bill wrote that in one of his books later on, but that's been debunked. But Bill, Bill always asked if people were licked. That was the thing. And um I believe, Shoemaker, Silkworth had a big influence on him with the powerless part. And, you know, that's where probably the suggestion for powerless, came out. The original manuscript says, you know, um, admitted we were powerless over alcohol, dash our lives and become manageable. Now, this is Ruth Hawks, and here, there's rumors that she should suggested it, and then I've heard recently that she just put it on there, the dash in between, you know, alcohol and that our lives are manageable. And what that is, that's called an M dash, and an M dash is a punctuation mark that's used to indicate a change in thought, a strong emphasis to a point. So, you're hammering home the unmanageability there with that strong point. And for the big book, we see here, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, dash, our lives have become unmanageable. So that, again, this is about powerlessness. Alcohol, we know, is an incurable disease that we're powerless to overcome on human power. Doctor's opinion gave us all the medical estimate of the nature of alcoholism. That's the mental obsession, physical allergy. And we have to take that literally. We're powerless over alcohol. It doesn't say I'm powerless over anything else. Not people, places, and things. Uh, you know, and that's the thing, because you're talking about people coming in here with denial at first, or years of denial. But the most, famous line that I always think about is written by the Tao Te Ching, and it's yeah, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one single step, and that's step one is beginning of our journey. So let's look at step two. So the there was rumors that originally it said, Cain to believe that God could restore sanity. Who knows, you know? But I believe if it was in there, Hank, and most likely Hank or Burwell suggested power grading yourself. Maybe that's the way it came out, you know. Um, and also, one thing I want to bring up is some of these guys may have just been, I think a lot of stuff they were all kind of in the same room with him, those guys I mentioned. But whoever came up with that power, grading ourselves, that widened the think about how widened the gateway for people to come here who otherwise, regardless of their belief or lack of belief, that really widened the gateway for people to be comfortable with it. And the original manuscript says the same thing as the big book. Came to believe power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. So step two, it's a mirror of the first step. Powerless, no power, we need power. It's telling us that's what step two is telling us. That's hope. So it's about hope. What is hope? It's the desire for some type of fulfillment, a desire to be, confidence that something can happen to you. And, just when you think all is lost, hope is there waiting for us, you know, and that road to recovery to begin with hope, and step two is, vital information that, all leading up to these steps we're going to look at. So step three. Now, as far as the word of mouth program goes, there was no, decision in there like that, but they did this anyways. It was something they did with guys that get on their knees and do a prayer. Um, but the original, somewhere it's rumored that, Burwell suggested guys who understood him. It may have been Hank as well, um, which didn't have, I mean, that they all agreed. They all liked that. And because they added that part in there, choose your own conception of God under Bill's story, which rumored it was Hank that did that. Um, the original manuscript made a decision to turn our will and lives over to the care and direction of God. And again, they took out direction because it was too straightforward. They just wanted care of God because it's a lot of weight. For the big book we made a decision to turn our will and lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Beautiful. So this is, we got to remember nothing significant ever happens without commitment. And commitment is a promise basically to completely dedicate yourself to new, something, especially like a new way of life. And you can become, so we become whatever we're committed to. And step three is about commitment, completely giving yourself to this program. So you're setting up to plan a recovery. So now we get to the meat, step four. So step four, um, this one's never been changed. From the manuscript to Bill said at one point from what he wrote down on the piece of paper, and it's made a searching for us more inventory ourselves. What step is more important? I mean, I can't say which one's more important than the other, but everyone looks at step four like when we do it. It's never been changed. There's never nothing added or changed. But the truth is I believe that Bill fought tooth and nail to have the word inventory in there. And I don't know if everyone understood what he was trying to get, because it's psychological stuff. But again, I don't think he got the feedback he wanted, but also I don't think anyone really fought him on it. But step four, it's about uncovering. And uncover means a real maybe stuff that we prefer to keep hidden or is not known. So we're uncovering the truth about ourselves. This is about uncovering the truth. And by inventory our resentments, fears, sex conduct, harm, we uncover why we have them, and we begin to see just how, destructive our life really was and why we really came to Alcoholics Anonymous. So we begin to see alcohol as just a symptom of our problems. And it's all about misdirected instincts. And, we all know what happens the second the pen hits the paper, you know. Step five. So again, we know they're big into Austria was big into confession. Um, for alcoholics that came to Oxford Group, that was a good starting point. But they didn't really have, even for especially for a bill camp, they had a lot of guys sticking. It wasn't enough. So the step four before it really made it deeper. I mean, if you imagine without inventory, imagine just step five, we would admit probably 10 things, if that. Um, and we remember half the things later. So again, as it appears in the manuscript, the same way as in the big book, admitted to God, to ourselves, and other human beings, exactly as are wrong. Um, there's rumors there that people didn't like the religious content of the word God in there, but um, it wasn't changed. And this is about step five. It's about discover, become aware of something you previously not known. And what is when you discover something that's not known about yourself, or it's a new awareness. So step five, we discover the obstacles in our path. Four, we uncover our wrongs. Five, we're discovering what drove us to those wrongs. So now awareness is kicking in. And this is, to me, where kind of goosebumps time, because you're thinking about, he's writing this stuff out just fast. Imagine what we do without 6 and 7. Imagine if we do at 4 and 5. Imagine if 6 was step 3. We would admit one thing, but the original manuscript said, willing that God remove all these defects of character. For the big book, and we got entirely ready to have God remove these defects of character. So they, I've heard the reason they changed it was because that God didn't sound right, and have God made more sense. Personally, I wish they would have had it like it's written in the big book, where it says, let God remove these defects of character. But it's fine the way it is. It kind of leaves it to mystery. But yeah, the back to the having, it's those words, I've heard it said that they changed it, that God to have God, because they wanted the person to think about letting God to do it. Then that's important. That God just didn't make sense. So this is about discarding. And what does discard means? What if your shirt's torn or your chair breaks, you throw it away? It's no longer useful. Step five, we discovered our defects, 6 and 7. 6, we're getting ready to let God remove, take these away. The stuff, that self-will stands between you and God. And we let this stuff go, your old beliefs, you push your old beliefs out of the way, you have a new experience that takes over you. That leads to, that's when the awakening starts to kick in. And that essence, the steps are not about gaining anything. They're about losing stuff so you can be closer to God. Steps 4 and 5 help us face and rid of the things that are blocking us. Step 6 is, I believe, is a pinnacle step, because we did every step for the ability to do step 6. It's like if you climbed a mountain 5 steps, and you're at the top. You got to do all those 5 steps to get to the mountain. So, this is where self-will run riot stops, and you let go, and you truly turn over. The inability to let go, is like being held captive. The ability to let go is the cage door is open, and what do we get from that? Freedom. Um, that's what that's all about. And so step 7, the manuscript, humbly on our knees, ask God to remove our shortcomings, holding nothing back. There's a lot of, this probably has some disagreement in there, because they took a lot of it out. Especially on her knees part, because it probably sounded too much like the Oxford Group. Um, uh, I think someone had asked them why on her knees, and he's probably glad and got the feedback. But we finally got The shortest step there is humbly ask him to remove our shortcomings. Shorter the better, I believe. This is about surrender. The second we let go, we've surrendered, abandoning ourselves to this way of life, and I give up control. We're trusting God with our lives, and this is where that happens. And we did step three, but now this is where it comes into gear. I can't, he can't, I must let God. That's the ultimate trust. I'm trusting God with my life, hang over to him, and we're abandoning ourselves to this way of life. Um, Now we get to the steps everyone's scared of. um, Step 8, original manuscripts made a list of all the people we harmed, became willing to make amends to them all. Well, I'm sorry, became willing to make complete amends to them all. Very interesting there. Very, very interesting. For whatever reason, the commit, they removed and changed complete amends, which I kind of wish they would have kept it on there. It would have like made a lot of confusion easier. Because what is the complete amends? It's completing what you ask how you can make it right. You know, it's completing what they say. But for the big book, we got made a list of all persons we have harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. And this step 8 is simply about willingness. It's more than just a list. And willingness is being ready. And you're never ready to make an amends until you get there. And then it's because it scares the shit out of us. And there's some of us not willing to do it. And here we're asking God, our new connection, with God to be willing, help us be willing, give us the strength to make these amends. You know, but making amends isn't difficult. Becoming willing to make amends is the difficult part. You know, and then you go do it. And you're like, oh. So step 9. Um, I've heard it bounced around, and not sure how true this is. That the word of mouth was made amends to all those we've hurt. I don't know, but um, one thing is about 8 and 9. I do know when Bill presented it, there was rumored confusion. Why does he have 2 amends on there? But I think once he explained it, it made sense. And probably was because Bill mentioned loopholes earlier, and alcoholics like loopholes, and it was the first time he used you know he used that phrase earlier, and boom. And then its original manuscript and Big Book are the exact same. So you have 2 important steps where they never got changed at all. Step 4 and now 9. Made direct. Oh, I'm sorry, they're not the same. Um, it's a little different. It says made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except to do so when you're there with others. So you have that. And one thing I want to point out, is, you know, I think a lot of people did like the wording Bill used here once he described it, but this is about repairing. Now I'm in the repairing mode. I've just, uncovered this, discovered, then I'm discarding, then I'm surrendering, now I'm repairing. And, amends it's for me, it was a bitter pill to swallow. But the is the greatest medicine I ever took, though, because it melted my pride and guilt, especially the guilt I had. I didn't think I could get past that guilt when I was in when I started focusing on the steps. I thought maybe it went away when I sponsored, but then I made amends and I went, oh, you know, if I, the way I looked at it, I've experienced, if I let God remove my defects, the only thing left to do is go out and repair them. That's the way I was pushed, and we do that by making amends face to face, not on the phone, not email, but we're freedom. It's out of the cage again. We make it right. The awakening, happens, and this is where, it really begins, because now we must maintain original manuscript in the big book. again, just like 4 and 9 and now 10 are exactly the same. Continue to take personal inventory, and we're wrong, properly admitted it. Wow. Again, this is a loophole right here. Remember what Bill said about resting on our laurels. The laurel wreath signifies, your champion. It comes from the old Roman games they used to do weekly in Rome. And um, now you got to maintain that. And this is not just about maintaining, it's about growth. But Bill thought, Bill was not going to change this. I don't know if anyone even I don't know if anyone really understood what he had put down, but the thing about 10 is this is about continuing. And this, you can't get past the word continue. And this, the second we enter this a new personal relationship with God, what do we do? We have to maintain it. When you buy a new car, you're not going you want to maintain that car. And step 10 is the essence of spiritual growth. Continues to keep doing 4 through 9 in all my affairs. When not if things crop up, when they crop up. So we continue to go further to mature our spiritual development, right? And because now we're awake. And so when new discoveries start to happen, and now all of a sudden we can also start knowing what it's like to be in the moment. And the best thing about 10 is when I get off gear a little bit, and just like when you ride your bike when you're a kid and your pant cuffs will get stuck in the bicycle chain. You try to ride it, but it gets stuck, but eventually you have to get off and do some work to get it out. Same thing here, it takes work. But you don't get steps in by staring at it. Remember these steps are off the wall. They're hard to find because that's the off the wall program. This isn't the big program. The off the wall program is where people want to try these steps off the wall. Step 11. I think all the members had the experience of the Oxford group. They knew that quiet time needed to be in there, but I think they needed to sound right. And they would be way different. And the manuscript we got sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God, praying only for the knowledge of his will and power for us to carry that out. Improve our contact with God. What are we missing out in there? Our conscious contact. Now, what would that step be with that? That's words that we may never heard before. Very radical sounding to me. Maybe it came from Hank, maybe it came from Emmett Fox, and Goldsmith, those guys that Bill read their stuff. But, they added God as we understood him, in there too, which may came from, Hank as well. It's rumored it did. I believe it did. But for the big book, we got sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God, understood, praying only for knowledge of his will and the power for us to carry that out. Beautiful. And this is about improving. It's time to know God, spend time with God. How do you form relationships with someone? You spend time. But this is really about union with God. And so I can know who I truly am. And what does improve mean? It means to make better. It means to make better. That's the essence of step 11. Spend time with God. But if I can't get that in step 11, it's like a test. I gotta go back and look at 10 again. Erase the whiteboard a little bit and go back and have a clear vision. It's like, clean your window in the house so you can see outside. It's all about change and how often we can change. Now, step 12, we all know, Bill laid in the top of it, had the spiritual experience and had, maybe there's guys out there that I could help. Manuscript, we had having a spiritual experience as a result of this course of action. We try to carry this message to other alcoholics, especially to others, especially alcoholics, and to practice this principle in our affairs. You can see Bill's vision in that. Others, especially, he saw this as big. He always tried to sneak that in there, and also course of action. you kind of get by reading that what he's trying to get a point, because he just said, you know, I've experienced as a result of this course of action, 4 through 9, 4 through 10, you know, wow, or 4 through 11, you know, but Bill Saul stuff is bigger, and it's why he said especially, you know, um, and then you know, the first edition we've had, having had a spiritual experience as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to alcoholics and practice these principles in all our affairs. When the second printing came out, they changed to awakening because not everyone having fire and brimstone experiences. So we got having had a spiritual awakening through all of these steps. We try to carry this message to alcoholics and practice these principles in all affairs. Carrying the, you know, part of living the principles as a way of life means it's your responsibility to pay it forward. The same way, you know, you were helped. It's the longest promise I ever kept to someone in my life. When my sponsors, I'll hear your fifth step, right from my fifth step, as long as you do the same thing I just did with you. I'm gonna do with you. And I went, absolutely. Um, and if you would have asked me that in step one, I probably would have said sure. And I wouldn't, you know, sure, because my word was no good. My word was pretty good by that time, getting better. And I kept that word. But we're trying to, you know, we're trying to carry something. We take the message from one place to another. You know, Bill knew that faith without works was dead, right? And to survive, they must carry the message. This is as much about helping us as helping the whole organization. You know, you know that the life will take on new meaning. It does. Um, I love Alan Watts, and there's a great Alan Watts quote that says, "The menu is not the meal. The menu is not the meal," and meaning is not knowing about the steps. It's knowing the steps through personal actual experience. How do you know something from experience? And that's what changes you. And true experience consists of the ability to look deeply into your innermost self, to what, you know, deepest dwellings of your being, and open closets you kept locked for years, and letting, you know, letting go of what you no longer need. You know, because the steps will rocket you into another dimension. One moment you feel like you're nothing, and a second later, brand new reality, like a way you never thought before. You go make an amends, you float away. You know, with a, you know, blink an eye, you're a part of life. You know, Bill expanded these steps from whatever it was. And, you know, he had a lot of anti-wiggle room steps, like, you know, 2, 6, 7, 8, 9. I mean, 8 and 10. But we always looked at that, you know, but let's go back. Now let's go to, we're on page 60. Um, it says, many have exclaimed, what an order. I can't go through with it. Do not be discouraged. Maybe this is Bill saying how he felt when he wrote the book. You know, I can't go through with it. Do not be discouraged. Not one of, but he says that not one among us has been able to maintain any perfect adherence to these principles. Thank God. We are not saints. Thank God. The point is, we're willing to go along spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides of progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. Now, here's the thing, and this is very important what I'm about to say. You know, spiritual progress in this, it's not, it's turned into a fellowship slogan. People say progress, not perfection. And leaving out the most important word there, spiritual. It's spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. That does not mean we can't have spiritual perfection, but it's the progress that gets us there. Go to page 14. Hold your place for a second. He's going to tell us that. This, for if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work, sacrifice, self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. You know, we can have that perfection, but it's not gonna, I mean, it's like it you know, means something that's whole, complete. We're seeking whole, you know, wholeness here. And we've been looking for that our whole life. But in the case of spiritual perfection means spiritually complete, you know, you know, I'm not saying we have it. We're not saints, like it is said. What I'm saying is extremely powerful spiritual vehicle we did that rockets people to a different dimension. It's like when you hear a fist step and the person changes right in front of you. When you make the amends, like I mentioned, you float away. Or when the person, the right words come out when you're talking, like where did that come from? The way I look at it is I don't put spiritual perfection ahead of progress because I said it earlier. But back to where we were at. Our description of the alcoholic, we all know what that is. It was Bill, and then Silkworth, and then more his solution moral alcoholism, the Chaldean agnostics, what that is, and our personal adventures before and after after 3 permanent ideas. Pertinent means relevant and on point. Logical is a good word. Logical ideas. In other words, yeah. So Big Book is all the information a person needs to understand the grave nature of alcoholism. We know that. And he keeps pausing in different places and wants to make us sure that there's no lurking notion that he wants to be convinced. And that's a very powerful word. And, being convinced before he can move on to 3. And, there's other parts similar to ABCs, later on in 76, he asks us for the stones properly in place, but the ABCs are not simple questions. And they are not simple beliefs. There's a big difference between believing and being convinced. Believing is simply acknowledging that something is true or real. Convinced means completely certain that something is true or real. See the difference? You're certain. What do you call that? You call it faith. You have faith, right? You're certain. It does not, do not, we sound weird. Do you believe you're alcoholic? Are you certain your alcohol cannot manage your life? If you are convinced, you're alcoholic and cannot manage your life. That's why I asked them. But to take it one step further, convinced means, that whole thing beyond doubt. So a key among the ABCs is being beyond doubt, being certain. Is being convinced, certain of each one, before we can do each step. So A, the alcoholic could not manage our lives. From all the information we discussed so far in these 31 weeks we've been doing this, whatever it's been with Howard and I, or going through your response up to this point, why alcoholic, the allergy, thanks to that concept, you get full knowledge of your condition. If one is not convinced, they need to go over those sections again. As far as being unable to manage your lives, it's the inability to manage, control, or accomplish things without great difficulty. So unmanageable is the opposite of that, inability to do that. There's no skipping on either one of this. There's no skipping on either one. So B, that probably no human power could relieve your alcoholism. That sounds like step 2. No human power means power is failed. We know that. If you're not convinced, it means, you're not 100% convinced. There's no free pass here. Maybe you're not. If you're not convinced of B, you're not convinced of 1 of A, right? Then it says that God could and would if you were sought. Now it gets deep. Step 2 says sought. This is about step 2, right? Sought is past tense for seek, right? That God could and would if you were sought. If God could and would if you take action, is what it's saying. Seek is action. We need to take action. If God could and would, wouldn't it make sense to seek him? Sadly, most people only know see from meetings, and they say it out loud. God could and would if you were a parrot talk, I call it. But C is a bridge between 2 and 3, as I believe. It's helping me ease towards this decision. And lots of people think that C is asking a person to believe that God could. No, I need to be certain here. This is where it's tough and confusing. And I've had this with sponsees a lot. It's not hard to become convinced of A and B because we have what? Evidence of A and B. C is tough because how can you be convinced that God could and will if you've never experienced God? And this is not a fake it till you make it thing. How do you become convinced that something can save you if you do not truly know it's capable of doing so? And it's by seeing what it's done for others. It's a spiritual woke person sitting right in front of you, your sponsor, hearing your fifth step, other recovery friends, you know, that the work we do. Obviously, the concept of the big work. So I say it's very important to find a solid, spiritually based meeting, of solution based meeting, I should say, so you can witness those people rather than the people that say these steps suck and all this stuff and blah blah blah. But just like the other, there's no free passes on any of these. But I'm going to read the manuscript of the ABCs, and it's pretty much the same, but there's a you instead of we. A, that you are alcoholic and cannot manage your own life. B, that probably no human power can relieve your alcoholism, and that God can and will. Then the last one, it's a lot better way you put it. And then look at this line, the most important line. I wish they would have kept in the big book. They took it out. If you're not convinced of these three vital issues, you ought to reread the book to this point, or else throw it away. How do I know he wants us to be convinced? Because he's secret, because they took it out of the big book. Well, they keep in the big book, but they took this out of here. He's telling us, if you're not convinced of these three vital issues, reread the book or throw it away. You're only going to seek God by being convinced, positive, with beyond doubt. You need it. Being convinced. There's that word again. Being convinced. We're at step 3. I wish they would have kept the previous one in there as well, which is that we decide to turn our will and lives over to the care of God's understood them. Just what do we mean by that? Just what do we do? We're going to explain that next week. And if all things go well, we're also going to start looking at instincts too. This is so we can prepare ourselves for step 3 and 4 step. All right, I'm going to stop the recording and